Linda Mcquaig, you have the full bio in your package, but she is, I just think, a total dynamo. We're so lucky to have her on our side, and we're very, very lucky to have her here today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Natalie, and thank you very much for that warm welcome. I must say, just watching that last panel was really energizing. It's really exciting to see that spirit of fight back. You know, I mean, these are, of course, very depressing times that we're living in politically. And I think one of the most important things that we have to do is to retain that sense of empowerment, and that we actually can make changes. Now, I want to talk today specifically about Harper. And Adrian in the last panel did get into some of the stuff about the federal thing. I know your focus has been primarily provincial. But I think, and especially with the 2015 election coming up, we have to be very focused on what's happened federally. And federally, Stephen Harper has taken us much farther and much faster towards implementing a right-wing agenda in Canada, essentially remaking Canada along corporate lines. And we have to be cognizant of that, and we have to rise up to that challenge. I mean, in many ways, Harper is every bit as extreme as the Tea Party people we see in the US. And in some ways, he's more dangerous. I mean, not only is he in power, but there's very few checks and balances in the Canadian system. So he, with a majority, he now has both the legislative and executive powers of government. And he has used those ruthlessly. I mean, he's been blatantly undemocratic, as we know. I mean, Darryl was mentioning even things like the way he's cutting off funding to all kinds of groups, actually using Revenue Canada to, you know, to harass legitimate charities. And, you know, it is true that, in fact, he's gone so extreme. Last week, the Birdwatcher Society of Canada was threatened with an audit because of its political activities. You know what its political activities were? Talking about climate change as it affects bird migration patterns. You know, that kind of dissent is no longer allowed in Stephen Harper's Canada. But the striking thing to me about all this is that the media doesn't capture this story about Harper extremism. I mean, a lot of the media is downright supportive of Harper, right? And even the media that isn't outrightly supportive, it treats him as a kind of reasonable person. Treats him as kind of operating within the Canadian mainstream, as opposed to being a radical extremist like the Tea Party. And I want to use the example of healthcare to actually show you what he's been able to accomplish with this media lack of attention. I mean, essentially, he's taken our public healthcare system, which is, of course, as we all know here and as we've been talking about, a treasured icon for Canadians. You know, he's taken that, and through simple changes, he has actually created a system where if those changes, he's put them in place, but if they're implemented after the next election, I think arguably, clearly, we'll be seeing the end of Medicare as we know it. And yet the astonishing thing is, Canadians don't know about that. They simply don't know about that change. And, you know, I would point to the media there, and that yes, the media covered it, but they never really drew out the implications of it. They treated it as kind of a, you know, the wrangling, federal, provincial wrangling, that kind of thing, not the end of Medicare. And of course, let me just quickly say, you know, when I hardly need to say it to this room, but why Medicare is so treasured by Canadians. And that is, of course, because it's based on the wonderful principles of equality and accessibility for all, regardless of income. You know, I mean, imagine that in the middle of this capitalist system that we have that reveres the marketplace above all, we have a system in which the marketplace is not, at least in theory, is not supposed to be a part of that. You know, under the market system, you only get what you pay for, and if you can't pay for it, you can't get something, right? And also, if you can afford it, you can get more, and you can get to the front of the line. But that isn't the way our public Medicare system works. So even in the midst of this capitalist society, we have this one area that we deem so important, healthcare, that we actually reject the market model. We actually say no to it. You know, if you think of, let's say, the difference between a poor person and a billionaire, I mean, the difference in terms of what they can access in society is just phenomenal, right? But the truth is, if they show up at the door of the emergency ward in a Canadian hospital, they essentially have exactly the same legal rights under the law. Now, I'm not saying they're necessarily going to be treated the same, because of course there's individual variations and people will sort of kowtow to the powerful. But the truth is, in Canadian law, the billionaire has no more right to care than the poor person, which is pretty damn astounding. Now you can imagine how this infuriates the rich, you know, because there they are in their private lives, able to have everything they want and enormous luxury and people kowtowing to them. But within this incredibly important area, they are no more empowered than anyone else. And that's what infuriates them. The other thing, of course, that infuriates them is that healthcare is a multi-billion-dollar business. Huge, huge business. And they want in on that profit-making. And of course, that's what the P3s and all these private clinics, that's them trying to get in and make money off a very important, very lucrative segment of the economy. So let's just look for a quick second about how Stephen Harper fits in with all this. You know, Harper is, of course, again, you don't really see this so much in the media, but he's a fierce ideologue. In fact, just before he returned to politics and took his big run for the head of the Canadian Alliance and then the Reform and then the Conservative Party, Unite the Right, just before he did that, immediately before he did that, he spent 4 years as head of the National Citizens Coalition. I mean, that is a striking thing, because the National Citizens Coalition is as extreme as you can get in terms of opposing Medicare. The National Citizens Coalition was set up in the 60s by this right-wing extremist called Colin Brown, who wanted to prevent the establishment of Medicare. That was the purpose of the National Citizens Coalition. Now, since then, it's branched out. It has all kinds of right-wing agendas, but that was its whole purpose for being. Stephen Harper spent 4 years, just before coming back to lead the Conservative Party, heading up that ultra-right organization. And one of the speeches he gave when he was head of the National Citizens Coalition, this was a speech to American businessmen. He said, you know, Canada is a Northern European welfare state in the worst sense of the term, and very proud of it. You can hear the contempt for welfare systems dripping in those kinds of words. So then he returns in 2002 and begins his ascent to power, and then he gets to be prime minister, unbelievably, in 2006. And as prime minister, he's much more careful. He doesn't actually talk very much about Medicare because he knows it's popular. And in fact, he waits until he has his majority. He gets his majority in May 2011, and immediately he begins working. And so by December 2011, a few months later, he has essentially put in place the mechanism that's going to break public health care. But he didn't do it by coming out and saying, okay, that's it. We're not going to have public health care anymore. We can't afford equality and accessibility. Never did that. He did it all so quietly that practically nobody even noticed. What he did, of course, was he killed the Health Accord. The Health Accord, as I'm sure you know, was an accord drawn up between the federal and the provincial governments in 2004. And the whole purpose of it was to begin restoring the federal role in financing public health care, which had been eroded over the years. I think Adrian had pointed out that it originally started out, the feds had contributed 50% of the cost of Medicare. Over time that had eroded, particularly in the 90s, with all those deep cuts in the Paul Martin budget. So the idea was to begin restoring that over time. It was negotiated with the provinces and the federal government, and importantly, it included a reaffirmation of the important central role the federal government had to play in implementing the basic principles of Medicare, basically the equality and accessibility and public administration. So Harper knew that this was going to expire, this deal was going to expire in 2014. And in 2011, December 2011, he simply declared it was over. He wasn't going to negotiate anymore. He wasn't, the expectation was there'd be a new set of negotiations. He said, no, I'm not going to negotiate. I'm not going to talk to the provinces at all. This is what we're doing. And he put forward his plan. Well, not his plan, his fact, because there would be no negotiation. So what he did was he put in place a new funding formula, which basically the net effect of it is that over the next 10 years, a total of approximately $36 billion will be taken out of the federal government will spend $36 billion less in transfers to the provinces. A huge cut. So instead of building up that federal component, we would continue the slide, from the 50%, then we're at 20% now. And after a couple of decades of this Harper scheme, we'd be at about 12%. So essentially taking away the federal support for Medicare. And probably even more important, what it did was it would just be a handover of money. There was no recommitment to the basic principles of Medicare. No recommitment and no federal role. So in other words, the federal government would not withhold money if the provinces didn't make their systems equal or accessible. It was up to the provinces to do, it will be up to the provinces to do whatever they want. So this is clearly, and we know the problems already with the provinces because the federal government has failed to enforce the basic principles. Now there aren't even going to be any basic principles to enforce. So I think it's pretty clear that if Stephen Harper gets elected, that will be the end of Medicare. We've got to stop Harper. Yeah. We absolutely have to. So that, you know, as I say, I don't think Canadians really know about it. I don't think the media has really brought this out. You know, apart from taking sides on it, they simply haven't made people aware of it. You know, it's been treated as a kind of, to the extent that it was covered, it was kind of a 1 or 2 day story. It was kind of a federal, provincial thing. And I would argue the reason for that is because even though Canadians care deeply about Medicare, the media commentators, they don't particularly care. In fact, I would argue they have basically bought the argument that we can't afford Medicare anymore. They think they're very sophisticated, you know, and they understand economics and everything like that. And their understanding leads them to think it's not sustainable. Because of course that's what's coming out of the right-wing think tanks, and that's primarily what they've been absorbing. So what they think is that we have to essentially open up to privatization. We hear this from Jeffrey Simpson, right, who's a major media influence. And you know, you hear the arguments, the population is aging, we've got so much more technology, it's just getting more and more expensive healthcare. It's simply too costly for government to provide anymore the full public healthcare system. But I guess what strikes me as odd about that, among other things, is that presumably we're still going to want to have health care. Presumably we're still going to need, you know, people will get old and they'll need treatment, we'll need access to those machines. So it really comes down to a question, do we pay for that health care privately, or do we pay for it publicly? That's the kind of the burning question. And it strikes me that the evidence is overwhelming that if we pay for it publicly, it's affordable. If we pay for it privately, it's actually not affordable. So the argument has actually been turned almost completely upside down. We're led to believe that, you know, it's not affordable to have public health care, and it is affordable to have private health care. What they really mean is it's too expensive for government. But then if government isn't going to pay and government can do it more cheaply, then we have to pay. So if it's more expensive overall for us, whether through government or through privately, isn't that bad? Isn't that more expensive? Isn't that less sustainable? You know, the simple truth is spending on public health care in this country, you know, despite what you hear, spending on public health care has been very stable as a percentage of GDP since the early 70s. We've been spending 4 to 5% of our GDP on healthcare. That's a sustainable amount. Now it's true that, you know, that healthcare is a rising proportion of the provincial budgets across the country. But that's for a couple of reasons. That's because, of course, the federal transfers have been cut. And also because the taxes in the provinces have been cut so dramatically. So what that means is the spending on healthcare has been the same, you know, as a proportion of GDP. But because there's less tax revenue coming in, and because provincial governments want to maintain healthcare because it's so popular and the public demands it, they've been paying the same amount, but there's less total pie to spend from. So the healthcare appears to be getting bigger and bigger. And what that's really meant is that everything else that the provinces pay for, like education, social welfare, post-secondary, all these areas have had to be cut back brutally. Affordable housing, everything like that, in order to keep the public healthcare system going. But it's not because the public healthcare costs have been rising. They've been stable. It's because the taxes that support the system have been cut so deeply. So while public healthcare is stable and affordable, the truth is there is an aspect of our healthcare system which is not actually stable, affordable. In fact, it's wildly out of control, which is the one area that's never identified, and that is the private part of our healthcare system. We have a significant part of our healthcare system that is privatized, that is private. Drugs, for instance, are private. Home care, private insurance, all the things we're talking about, you know, with the P3s and the extra costs and that, all those costs are growing exponentially. They're out of control. You know, I think Adrian referred to the drugs. Drugs particularly, we pay 30% more for our drugs than other OECD countries typically do. We're second in the world in terms of high drug costs after the US. And the reason for that is, of course, because we don't have a public healthcare system attached to it, because we don't use the public healthcare model for it. So instead, as you know, other countries that have Medicare systems, they have also pharmacare systems to keep the costs down. We don't have that, so we've been at the mercy of these big pharmaceutical, enormously powerful countries. And we've, of course, kowtowed and given in to them in the NAFTA deal and done it again in the CETA deal. But what the amazing thing is, if Harper was concerned about the affordability, the answer is in getting those private costs under control. And we have the perfect example with pharmacare, because as others mentioned earlier, you know, there's excellent evidence that pharmacare is just terrific at keeping costs down, because for one thing, it does a rigorous review of drugs, discards drugs that are useless and simply expensive, and it has bargaining power to, you know, as a single consumer against pharmaceutical, you got no bargaining power. Governments collectively have great bargaining power. So you know, as we've seen that study showing that, in fact, if we cut or if we put in place a national pharmacare program, we could actually give full drug coverage to everybody in the country and save $11 billion. You know, now that doesn't mean government costs would go down $11 billion. Most of that $11 billion cost is paid by us. But that's a saving too. It's not all just about government deficits, it's about what we pay as well. So clearly, a national pharmacare program, and by the way, every study in Canada that's looked at this since 1964 has recommended a national pharmacare program. But no, we don't have it. It's a terrific idea, but what are the chances of getting a national pharmacare program when the guy that is running the country is the former head of the organization that did everything it could to stop public health care in the first place? Surprise, surprise, he's not interested. What I'm really getting at here, though, is that public health care is affordable. In fact, it's really the only way to contain the enormous costs of the healthcare system. And so what it reveals, I think, is that this whole cutback in the end of the health care and all that, it just has nothing whatsoever to do with affordability. Despite what the pundits say, it has nothing to do with affordability. And in fact, it's particularly ridiculous because now we're at a stage where, we're now getting into surpluses. We're going to have a $6 billion surplus this year. The next year, $8 billion. And it gets bigger and bigger. So in fact, it's just, a no-brainer that there is, in fact, lots of money to, in fact, properly build up our public health care system. And it's very instructive that if you look at that surplus, what the Harper government's planning to do is instead give it all away in tax cuts.
Wait.
Okay? And I want to just quickly put this in some kind of context, because it's one thing that they're going to give away this $6 billion, $8 billion, etc. But they've been cutting taxes relentlessly since the late 90s. Really started under the Liberals. But it's picked up with a fury under the Conservatives. So all told, since the year 2000, almost 15 years ago, the amount of tax cutting, both corporate tax cutting, private, personal income, HST, the total amount of taxes that have been cut total $50 billion a year. So in other words, if we had the same tax system in place now that we had back in 1997, I'm only talking federal money here, the federal government would have an extra $50 billion a year to invest in all kinds of things. That, in a nutshell, is the conservative revolution right there. What they have done is that they have so starved the public coffers that there isn't money to create, to enhance, to build our public programs. So increasingly what that means is we won't have programs based on equality and accessibility. People will be turned over to deal with for themselves through the marketplace. That is what the conservative revolution sought to achieve. And almost quietly, without it ever being announced or without us ever really realizing it, they have achieved that. Again, imagine what we could do if we had that extra $50 billion a year. Imagine what we could do with health care, with child care, with pensions, with helping the homeless, with, we could have free university tuition. It's just unbelievable, the things that we could have. Instead, of course, we've had all this tax cutting, and we're moving now to deeper tax cutting. And by the way, the tragedy of all this is that Harper has not only done this tax cutting, but he's created a kind of whole philosophy around tax cutting, a kind of hatred of taxes, so that it's going to be very difficult to restore those taxes. And frankly, I would have to add some criticism of the opposition parties for putting up so little resistance to all that tax stuff. All they had to do was mount the arguments about the importance of public programs, the importance of equality, accessibility, all these things. And I think Canadians would have understood it and rallied around it. But instead, they just kind of bought into the rhetoric, of the new kind of business, corporate-dominated political agenda. But let's just quickly take a look at what Harper is planning to do with the surplus, because I think it's so revealing, the $6 billion. And let me just first point out is, we have another option on the table, and that is, we've already heard from Tom Mulcair, the Democrats, saying we should have a national child care program, okay? And this program that he's proposing, it's certainly not as comprehensive and full as it should be, and it goes nowhere near reaching the kind of level of equality and accessibility we see in Medicare. But I think the point that's worth making is that it is a step in that direction. It's a step away from the idea that the market decides everything. It's the idea that, early childhood education, childcare, is something that people should have access to, and it shouldn't depend on their income. Okay, so that's what Mulcair is going to do with a good chunk of the surplus. This is what Stephen Harper wants to do instead. And it's interesting because it's also sort of loosely based around children. This is Harper's plan to introduce income splitting for parents with children under 18. Okay, so for dealing with sort of different approaches to helping parents with children. What Harper wants to do is income splitting, okay, which means that if you have two parents, they can sort of share income, okay? So that, I mean, they do share income, but for tax purposes, the person with the bigger income can transfer a big chunk to the person with the little income. Well, the simple truth is, this offers virtually no benefit, except in situations where you have basically one earner, and that earner is very high income, and you have one person not working, like a stay-at-home mother. And in that situation, it can be very lucrative. So what we have here is a program which the beneficiaries are almost entirely rich families with stay-at-home mothers. And we're talking about a program, this program is going to cost, according to the federal estimates even, $3 billion a year. Like more than the program that Mcquaig is proposing for childcare. And if you add the fact that the provinces will also lose money as a result of this, it comes up to more like $5 billion a year, okay? And this is what it'll look like. 86% of Canadian families, 86%, that's almost 90%, like virtually everybody. You know what benefit they will get on average from this income splitting? Anyone want to guess? Did I hear nada? That is precisely correct. They will get zero. I mean, this is astonishing, right? Whereas the 1%, the top 1%, virtually all of the benefits will go to people in that crowd. And so, for instance, the average benefit for people in that 1% will be $6,500. So imagine like there's a truckload of money from the surplus, billions of dollars in the back of a truck that's driving around the country. It passes by 86% of the households, just drives straight by, nothing for you, nothing for you, nothing for you, and makes a beeline to Rosedale and the bridle path, and starts dropping off at the doorstep packages of, $6,500. I mean, it's, well, as Neil Brooks put it, he's a tax professor, he said, it's immoral. I mean, it is just fundamentally immoral. So I want to just quickly point out that all this tax cutting, of course, has led to all kinds of deep cuts in government spending. I was mentioning about how the other areas besides healthcare have suffered so much. Our hospitals, our universities, how do we make up these costs? Well, I mean, Doris was talking about medical tourism as one horribly bankrupt idea. The other thing, of course, that we hear about all the time is philanthropy.
Yes.
Right?
Charity.
The rich are coming forward. Well, look at, the Peter Monk Cardiac Center, all the buildings at U of T named after big rich people. So in fact, what's happened is as government funds have dried up because we don't have the revenues anymore because of the tax cuts, the rich have been tapped to contribute their own funds. But of course, when they contribute, they get all kinds of tax advantages. So what they're contributing is far, far less than it appears to be, far, far less than they get public credit for. But I want to actually point to another problem with this. You might think, well, if we get money from the rich through philanthropy, isn't that the same as getting it from them through taxes? But actually it isn't. It's totally different. When we collect money from the rich through taxes, that's democracy. Because we collect collectively the money we need, and then we collectively decide how we're going to spend it. That's the essence of democracy right there. Whereas if the rich contribute through philanthropy, they get to make the decisions. I mean, for one thing, they decide where the money's gonna go. You know, if they are concerned about colon cancer because a member of their family died of colon cancer, they may make a big bequest for that, but maybe that shouldn't be the top priority. You know, or they they almost never, by the way, contribute to things like community centers in poor parts of town, but they do contribute heavily, like, to their alma mater, because they want their name on prestigious buildings in the universities. I just want to tell you quickly about one deal. This was a couple of years ago. Peter Monk, who I know you know was head of Barrick Gold, he donated $35 million to set up a global study center at U of T. Well, actually, his donation ends up being much less than that. It's at least probably no more than 17 million, and could be well less depending on how the deal was structured. But in any event, he made that deal, and yet, you know, this raises the question. Here he is, like a big mogul with, you know, interests in mining all over the world, which are very controversial. Do we really think, you know, that the students and the professors in that program are going to feel free to criticize international mining? Well, let me just tell you, I got a copy of Monk's deal with U of T, and you can actually see that the director of the Monk School ultimately reports to Peter Monk's board of directors. So you can imagine how much critical content is going to be encouraged. But I just want to even more draw attention to one other aspect of that deal that just absolutely astounded me when I read it. And that is, the U of T signed this deal with Peter Monk, which allows him to specify that the front door of the Monk mansion, where the global studies will be housed at U of T, the front door will be reserved specifically for senior faculty and guests of the school. Unbelievable. And it goes on to specify the rest, that is students, junior faculty, members of the public who, by the way, paid for most of the costs of that building, they will be required to enter by the back door. I kid you not, that is in the agreement. So what this strikes me as just a kind of repulsive vision of special privilege, of elitism, everything that's against the kind of principles of equality and accessibility. Now, if I have just another quick couple of minutes, I want to leave you with some good news, okay? Because I said a few bad things. Okay, 2 minutes for good news. Okay, the good news is Canadians actually care, and other people have made this point today, care about public programs. They care about our social programs. Despite all the propaganda from the Fraser Institute, the indifference from the media, if you do serious polling, what you find is Canadians care about those programs. Sure, if you ask them, would you like a tax cut, or would you like, would you like a tax cut? Would you like some chocolate? Would you like some ice cream? You know, they say, yeah, I'd like it. But if you ask them to choose, do you want a tax cut, or do you want to reinvest in healthcare and education? Overwhelmingly, by margins over 80%, Canadians say reinvest in healthcare and education. It's time we demanded that this be a more equal country. It's time we demanded that this be a country where everyone enters by the front door.